So in the last module, we looked at how change is managed within organizations. And in this session, over the next three sort of sessions, we'll actually look at and explore how organizations balance risk in terms of the risks associated with making changes, the risks of developing a product, and how we balance those risks in terms of balancing those risks versus the opportunities of making a change or developing a product. Now, in this slide covers some of the questions we'll hopefully answer over the next couple of sessions. Is your quality organization effectively the balancing the risks with these potential opportunities? Are you using the right tools? And we'll cover a few tools in the next few slides. And really, are you anyway be biased in terms of your ability to adequately assess risk in terms of your organizational changes you're making or the products you're developing? So we'll start off quite gently. We'll talk about the concept of risk, the concept of safety. We'll go into a bit more depth in terms of one of the risk management standards associated with medical devices, 14971. So we'll explore that standard and how it's applied within organizations. So really, we'll start really with sort of the concept of management of risk. It's bandied around as a phrase, not just in healthcare, but obviously in the press, in terms of banking and across lots of industries. There's very often today very focused on we need to manage risks better. But what do we really mean by risk management? So essentially, it's got a number of components in terms of obviously identifying the risks, assessing the risks. Controlling the risks, and then understanding how you review those controls. So this sort of cycle is actually reflected in a lot of the standards and the regulations, and we'll basically explore some of these steps, what they mean in practice in terms of how you apply them within your business. So the purpose of risk management really is to achieve safety, and it's performed to protect the patient, the end user, and also it doesn't necessarily have to be the patient, the end user. It could be your compliance status. So there are various risks that could impact your business, and they can impact your business in multiple ways. And this unit will cover risk more broadly in terms of where you balance risk with opportunities. So the risk generally will focus on the patient and the end user of the product, but it doesn't necessarily have to in terms of risks. Risks come in a sort of a reputational or financial or economic sort of fashion, but generally we'll look at risk from the perspective of the patient and the end user of the device. So talk about risk management in terms of its potential to be used to achieve safety. Well, what do we mean by safety? So what is the definition of safe? So one of the generally accepted definitions is the absence of unacceptable risk. So it isn't the absence of all risk, as a zero risk is completely unattainable, but it's basically the absence of unacceptable risk. And you have to decide what is unacceptable risk versus the benefit of the activity of the process or product you're doing. So in this slide, the guy on the forklift truck, on the shelves, obviously feels the benefit of using the forklift truck outweighs the obviously the safety implications of falling off and breaking his leg. Ditto the guy in the bottom slide, obviously feels that in his mind was an acceptable risk in terms of drilling through some metal into some wood with no sort of safety shoes or any sort of protective equipment at all. So really, safety is really in the eye of the beholder in terms of you have to decide what level of risk you will actually accept. And that's a general concept within risk management. You or somebody has to decide what is good enough in terms of how acceptable the risk it can be or should be. So if you look at an activity that we've probably all done many times in terms of what are the risks playing a video game, and it really depends who you ask. Basically some people say actually there's no risks at all, but then when you dive into it, you can say, well, if it's a young child playing video games, they could see content that could be sort of unacceptable and not appropriate. It could strain their eyes. So you can quickly sort of even when you look at quite an innocuous activity like playing a video game, you can actually come up with quite a list of risks in terms of that you could feel that these were at times unacceptable risks if you did them too much. So in terms of risk, it really is in the eye of the beholder in terms of how you actually decide, what is risky or not. And obviously, the child playing the video game will feel it's completely safe, and they just want to get on and play their game. And maybe their parents believe that that isn't always the most appropriate hobby to have if it's beginning to sort of eke into their ability to do their homework, or it's straining their eyes, or as I said, they're seeing content that may not be appropriate for their age. So if you look at another activity into what are the risks going into a crowded bar, so if I asked this question 5 years ago, then there'd be quite limited responses in terms of you could get lost, you could get into a fight, you could could be pickpocketed in terms of losing your money. So those are the sort of responses that you probably have got 5 years ago. Now you've probably got different response. Only 2 years ago, at the height of COVID, a lot of the feedback would have been, well, actually, I could catch COVID, I could catch something. There was a real threat to my health in terms of going into a crowded environment. And if I showed this slide to somebody a couple of years ago, they were probably flinched in terms of this looked quite an alien concept of all of these people packed together within a bar, and it looked quite unsafe. While if you showed it to somebody sort of 10 years ago, they would say, well, actually, this looks a really good bar. I wouldn't mind going there. So really, it's, in terms of risk, your perceptions of risk can change depending on your experience and the current environment you've got. So there's always this balance between a risk and benefit. So COVID is quite a good example to explore in terms of, if you look at the concept during the COVID pandemic of shielding. So there was real benefit of shielding individuals away from potentially catching the virus. Obviously social distancing in terms of making sure you didn't come into contact with individuals. You had to be 2 meters apart, and all of that sort of stuff we did, a couple of years ago. So that at the time we felt there was real benefit to that in terms of the shielding and the social distancing. We now know that there was benefit to that, but there was also an associated risk that's becoming apparent. During the COVID pandemic, there was a degree of social isolation of individuals as they were sort of excluded from society because they had to shield. There obviously was a beginning to understand an impact on the schooling of children as they were actually unable to go to school, and we're beginning to feel the repercussions now in terms of access to primary health care during the pandemic meant that maybe some ailments that should be treated really swiftly in normal times, they were less able to be diagnosed, and so things like cancers and heart conditions that actually weren't treated as promptly as they could, and basically there was a degree of risk in that delay is now causing some issues within society. So again, this balance between risk and benefit is apparent with any sort of risk or any activity you want to make a change. There's obviously a degree of risk, but obviously you're making that change for a degree of benefit and opportunity. So again, all about risk management, all about how you manage this balance between the products. Obviously, it's used doing post-market surveillance in terms of understanding what are those signals from this field telling you in terms of risk and the impact to your patients. It's used doing change management in terms of if you make changes to your product, your process. Obviously, you need to assess that risk in terms of making those changes in terms of the impact. Obviously, process validation involves a degree of risk assessment in terms of when you go through any validation exercise. When you assess suppliers in terms of risk, in terms of critical suppliers, key suppliers, single suppliers, you really are using risk management in terms of assessing those suppliers. And even internally within the organisation in terms of deviations and non-conformities and such like around deviations from the quality system expectations. Very often you use risk management to understand what's the criticality of that deviation, how important is that deviation to your quality system and compliance and to the end user. So basically you're using risk management. Very often the focus within medical devices it's doing the product design, which it is, and it's very important. But really, organizations need to look very broadly in terms of how they use risk management in terms of across different areas in the life cycle of the product's development, manufacturing, and obviously shipping. So what is risk? So there is an ISO standard in terms of risk management, and it defines risk as the effect of uncertainty on objectives. And it can be a positive or negative deviation from what you're expecting. And it's a very goal-orientated view of risk. So this is a relatively new way of looking at risk. Very often you very focus when you talk about risk, you automatically assume it's going to be a bad thing, a negative thing, but it doesn't have to be. It's basically, it's fundamental level. It's an uncertainty on objectives. You don't know what you're going to get. There are more traditional views in terms of risk that see it as an impact in terms of the probability of something happening and the impact of that. And that's a very event-orientated view of risk. And both definitions can coexist, but generally we talk about risk management and assessment of risk within the medtech industry in terms of the probability of something happening combined with the impact of that thing happening. So it's a very event-orientated risk. So in the following content, we'll tend to sort of explore that sort of view of risk in terms of how it's actually defined and how it's assessed and controlled. So there are numerous standards and directives which mention risk, and obviously you've got the risk management standard 14971, which is specific for medical devices, and the assessment of risk is also buried in the previous directives in terms of the European Union. Any risk which may be associated with their use of the device must be acceptable when weighed against the benefits, and we'll talk later on about this balance between risk and benefit. It's embedded within IVDR in terms of regulations that are now live, in terms that the risk management should be understood as a continuous iterative process, and we'll come on to that in terms of this continuous cycle of a process throughout the entire life cycle of the device, requiring regular systematic updating. So the requirement for risk management isn't just a fashion or fad. It's actually embedded within the standards, and it's obviously embedded within the regulations for in this case in vitro diagnostics, but also medical devices. So this rather busy slide just covers some of the words that you will encounter when you dive into risk management, and some of these we'll cover in the subsequent content. Hazard, harm, risk, benefit. We've mentioned state of the art. Foreseeable misuse. Hazardous situations. So as we go through some of the content, some of these will resonate as we sort of discuss them a bit more. So this slide was taken from the ISO, also based on the ISO guide in terms of the development of safety aspects for the international standards. So the general core concept of risk management that feeds into medical device development is this concept that you can have a hazard through a series of sequence of events can lead to a hazardous situation. So it's got to be a sort of a foreseeable sequence of events you can understand. So a hazard going into a hazardous situation, and that hazardous situation can actually cause harm. So basically, the whole concept of hazardous situation, harm is deeply embedded within the risk management methodology for medical devices in terms of defining the impact on the end user. Actually, there's no concept of detection in there, so some of the concepts within FMEAs aren't in there. And really will explore this pathway a bit more in detail in terms of, you get a hazard leading to a hazardous situation, and then some form of harm, which may not be certain. There's a degree of probability of that hazardous situation actually turning into harm, and that combination of the harm and the probability is a general concept we sort of associate with the word risk. So just an example, a hazard could be a glass bottle, and the hazard sequence events could be the bottle falls on the ground and breaks, and the hazard situation could be broken glass, and the harm it could be caused is if you could actually cut your feet in terms of stepping on the glass. So to explore this one a bit further in terms of, just because you've got broken glass on the floor doesn't mean you will always get harm. So the situation is very important here in terms of circumstances affecting the severity. Obviously, broken glass within a workshop where everybody's got safety shoes and is protected is a different situation than broken glass in a school playground where children may be playing in terms of and they're sort of, the potential to become in contact with that broken glass. So it's not just the hazardous situation will always turn into something bad. There is a degree of context in terms of the situation has to sort of drive this poor outcome. So just explore this concept a little more in terms of how hazard turns into harm. So on the left-hand column, in terms of, you've got a lack of homogeneity in a batch. So basically, you've got a batch of product that is maybe a diagnostic. The hazardous situation is you could have unreliable results if you use some product that could be biased, and the harm of that is that you could get a delay in treatment because you get the wrong result. So in the middle one is another sort of more common one, in terms of the hazard could be accidental mechanical damage to the product, such that you get a sharp surface and potential to harm through a physical injury in terms of the end user cutting themselves. And the example on the right, you could have unclear or inadequate instructions in the literature for the products, and then the hazardous situation is the diagnostic use is unclear, and then that harm is basically the end user of the product could actually use the incorrect samples or process the material incorrectly, doing the execution of the diagnostic. So again, you've got this concept of hazard going into hazardous situation, leading to a potential harm. So to take a step back in terms of how you assess risk within organizations, especially around healthcare organizations, there is a requirement really at the very beginning. You designate who's responsible for that, and you make sure that they're appropriately qualified. So basically, you will need a working team that's sort of responsible for the risk management aspects of the product development. And they must obviously contain people that are knowledgeable of the product and experience of the product, but also experience of the product in the end use, in terms of how it's used in agri in the field. Also, how it could be used correctly, but also how it could be used what is known as unintended use, in terms of using the product in a way that you really shouldn't, but you could predict somebody could do that in terms of misusing the product. And really, that group does need to have some knowledge of the risk management methods, because that is the framework how they're going to assess risk and agree how to control it. And really, you need a person that's responsible for coordinating all the work in terms of that sort of activity. And usually the working team will be composed of people from R&D, production, quality control. So they will cross the different functions within the organization. And it's very important, if you've got a medical device or you've got a clinical product, you get some input from medical affairs or clinical affairs, or some individual that's actually knows how that product is used in the clinical setting. Without that, you can't get the true picture of the risk to the patient or the individual, unless you've got that clinical input into the assessment of risk and whether the control measures really are actually adequate. So this is taken from the standard. We'll go into details. So there are various stages within risk management. It starts with risk analysis, and then you evaluate the risks, and that's combined in combinations called risk assessment. And then you talk about controlling the risks, and you understand if you control the risk, what's the overall risk of the device. And then there's a degree of management review to sign it off. And then you assess from the post-production activities whether your assessment of risk and your quantification of risk has actually been acceptable. And if it hasn't, there's an iterative process where you go back through the loop again and either change the device or increase the control measures, or make it, or as we come to make a judgment whether the risk balance is adequate. So the whole of this sort of shebang is called the risk management plan and risk management in general. And we'll sort of talk through these stages in the subsequent couple of slides. So risk analysis is the systematic use of the available data in order to identify hazards and assess risks. And it's based on the predicted use of the diagnostics and how it could be misused. And you can base that on a similar device. So you don't always have to start from scratch. So basically, you can use a similar device in terms of your template. And the design of that device and its use really should be reviewed by individuals who are close to the situation in terms of how it's manufactured and also how it's used. It needs to be documented in terms of foreseeable misuse. And then basically there's a requirement in this analysis that any characteristics that could affect the safety of the diagnostics are also documented. And then any foreseeable hazards are basically associated with, in this case, a diagnostic in its normal use, and also its predicted misuse should also be evaluated. So there's an analysis evaluation stage in terms of looking at what are all the different risks, and this. So this really comes down to how you assess risk. So there are two really main components of risk assessment. In terms of the first one is severity, is how bad something could be, and the definition of severity is really is the measurement of the potential consequences of the hazard, or the possible consequences of the hazard. So the key words here are possible consequences, and we'll come on to that in terms of the consequences have to be realistic. So basically, to measure to define severity in terms of what is severity, all you got to do is really answer the question, what's the worst that would happen if I hadn't caught this, if I hadn't detected it. So that's generally, we'll come on to that, is how you measure the severity. Now, unlike FMEAs, they're within the risk management approach for the 14971, there is actually no separation between detection and there's no detection component buried in there. And very often FMEAs, you will see that detection component drawn out, but it's actually buried in the next component called probability of harm, in terms of what's the probability. You've got the severity, how bad something could potentially be. What's the probability of that actually turning into harm? So this is a probability of occurrence of harm table. It's a very similar one to a lot of tables used in the industry. It has 5 levels, and it goes from improbable, less than 1 in a million, right to greater than 1 in 100. And in general, organizations need to develop their own tables in terms of what they mean by the different incidences of probability, going from very, very rare to very, very frequent, and decide how many bands. But generally, the businesses very often have a sort of a 5 levels of probability of harm. Now, the probability estimation is actually a quite difficult one to estimate, in terms of often when you have the medical device at the beginning, you haven't got any data available to make an accurate assessment of that. So it is a bit of a finger in the air exercise in terms of, this is the severity of an issue. How often will that generate an issue in terms of what's the probability of it happening? You can look at other diagnostics or products for similar data to see get a ballpark of what the potential for that is. Generally, you should err on the side of caution. And an important thing is you should base your probability estimate on the presumption that you will implement any control measures, but you will. So I'll explain that a little more in detail shortly, in terms of what is the probability of that severe thing happening in the absence of any controls. And then we'll come on to it, how we talk about controls to bring very often that probability estimate down into a level that you will accept. Conversely, severity very often has a sliding scale going from 1 to 5, where 1 is negligible, no harm to the user, and then 5 is potentially could kill somebody. And it's up to manufacturers to decide what sort of scale they have. You can have it 1 to 10, you can have 1 to 5, or 4 levels. It really doesn't matter really. Obviously, as the levels become smaller and smaller, the granularity becomes less and less. But obviously, the more levels you have, you get grids that when you become very, very complicated. So generally, a 5x5 matrix of severity versus probability of harm is a very common matrix. Again, severity is the measurement of the possible consequences of the hazard. Again, it should be based on the presumption that harm will happen or has happened. Again, these consequences need to be realistic in terms of, what's the possible consequences of the hazard, not the impossible consequences of the hazard. So really into the next stage here is a risk evaluation. For each of these potential hazardous situations called generating harm, you're looking to try and evaluate the severity and also the probability of that bad thing happening in terms of impact. So doing the risk evaluation stage, you essentially put all of those the risk failure modes in terms of the product on a risk grid, and this is just the grid of the probability of harm versus the severity. And generally, they look something like this, where you've got a green zone where you're quite happy in terms of it's either low severity or the probability of it happening is very low. Versus the other side of the grid where you've got really bad things happening very, very often, and that's bad. And you've usually got a middle zone where it's sort of, it's in the middle of, it could potentially happen, but it's not going to be terrible if it happened, but it wouldn't be very good. So it tends to be this orange band. And again, it's up for each manufacturer to decide, how these grids look and when their boundaries between what they'll accept and what they won't accept. So in this grid, it's called unacceptable, acceptable, undesirable, unacceptable. And I've seen grids where it said tolerable, intolerable, and acceptable in the middle. So it doesn't really matter in terms of the naming, but generally you've got 3 bands where you say if it's in a red zone, it's bad, you need to get out of that. If you're in a green zone, generally okay, you're happy. And then there's a room for discussion in terms of this middle zone, in terms of whether you're willing to accept that risk in terms of the combination of the severity and the probability. So generally, if it's in the unacceptable zone, you have to talk about control measures to reduce the risk. And if it's in the middle zone, really you're talking about you should apply control measures as far as possible. And basically, if that's not always possible, then you're into a discussion whether the benefit of the device outweighs those risks, so that you're making a sort of a judgment call in terms of what that residual risk is. There is an expectation within the IVDR regulations that you should continuously reduce risk. So even if you are in the acceptable zone, you are actually expected to at least consider, driving that risk down even lower. So there is an expectation within the IVDR and the MDR regulations that just because you land in a green zone, you shouldn't say, if you can do something and you can reduce risk further, you really should consider that. So this slide really covers what I've just said in terms of the standard actually says that if the risk is acceptable, it's not required to apply the requirements of risk control to the hazardous situation. This was in some of the earlier guidance in terms of that standard. It's now aligned itself more with the regulations, which there is an expectation that all known and foreseeable risks and any undesirable effects shall be minimized. So basically the regulations have out-trumped the standard in terms of, if you have to follow the MDR or the IVDR, all known unforeseeable risks should be minimized. There is an expectation you should, if you can, reduce risk as much as possible. So this takes us to the next step in terms of how you control the risk. So each of those risk failure modes, you've made an assessment in terms of the severity and the probability of harm, and now you're talking how you're actually going to control and reduce that risk in terms of lowering that risk and the potential impact to the end user or the patient. And generally in the standards, there's a sort of like a pecking order of things you need to consider. The first thing you need to consider is basically your device will be safe because it's inherently safe by its design and its manufacture, and we'll come on to that. The next port of call is basically you make it safe by protecting the individual, protective measures. And then the last port of call, which is relatively weak, is you make the device safe by giving basically information and training to the end user in terms of information within the IFUs and labeling and instructions, etc. So the first protocol and the majority of the safety controls within medical devices are around it's inherently safe by design and manufacture. So these all of the controls are in terms of design control, that they go through a very rigorous procedure and a very stepwise procedure in terms of the design controls, in terms of turning the user requirements into design inputs and outputs, which are verified, and then the output of that is validated against the user requirements. So devices are actually manufactured in a very structured way in terms of design controls, and also when they are manufactured post-launch, there's a whole framework of the QMS, which actually ensures that they're manufactured consistently and reproducibly in terms of how the manufacturing is controlled and how suppliers are controlled and raw materials are controlled. So basically, virtually a lot of the controls within your manufacturer will talk about your quality system, which is the framework for actually making sure that your product is inherently safe by design and manufacture. The step down from that is obviously protective measures in terms of you're protecting the individual via controls or alarms or other sort of control mechanisms which are weaker. And then the final stage is where obviously you're protecting the control measures are basically relatively weak because you're telling the end user, don't do this, store it at this temperature, use these materials in this order. So it's all around labeling and warnings and training and competency. So it's a relatively weak way of controlling the risks compared with the design controls and the rigor of the quality system, which will generally be a lot of your controls in terms of controlling risk. So after the control measures are implemented, or you basically say, well, actually, if this is the level of risk, and if I implemented this control measure, there's an assessment of what's the residual risk after you've implemented those, or you expect to implement those controls. And basically, if that residual risk is fine and you're landing in a good zone, then basically you just have to document the risk, the benefit over the device outweighs the risk, and you don't have to do any more. If you're in the middle zone, then you're really talking about, can you reduce the risk even further? Is it practical to do a redesign? But you're in this middle zone where you can make a judgment call in terms of, does the benefit of the device outweigh some of that residual risk? And basically, if the benefit outweighs the risk, then you can determine that it's actually acceptable. And obviously, if you're in that red zone where it's unacceptable, really you have to really justify, getting out of that red zone and make it, and even if you have to sort of do some, a redesign of the product to reduce either the severity, if that's possible, or drive the probability of harm to a lower level. So this is a general example of a risk grid in terms of a risk assessment. So in this product, you've basically got a device that tests for antibodies. So you've got a hazard. The device is not specific for those particular type of antibodies, and that could cause a hazardous situation in terms of you could have a device with poor specificity or sensitivity, and the cause of that, it could be incorrect design of the device. Now this column is called cause. It's within the standard. It's more called foreseeable series of events that leads to the hazard situation. So in some risk files, this cause column is named to be more aligned with the standard. But generally, it's what's the cause of the hazardous situation. That then potentially could lead to harm. In this case, you can have erroneous results and a delay in the medical decision, and subsequently you've got a degree of probability that's been assessed and severity, and it's landing in a band in terms of it's unacceptable. So in terms of the control measures and the expectations, you verify those control measures. There's obviously control measures within the quality system in terms of how raw materials are sourced. There's design controls, and there's an expectation during the product design. You verify the specificity and sensitivity of product, doing claim support to justify that you feel that the probability is being reduced, and you've driven that risk down into an acceptable level, and the benefit of the device is greater than the risk. So basically, for each of these basically failure modes, you will need to look at the risk level pre and post controls and decide whether you're happy with accepting that risk. And you also need to look at all of the risk control measures holistically in terms of how they all combine together in terms of what's the overall residual risk of the device. So some items to consider when completing a risk assessment template, it was really be careful when documenting any required mitigations. They need to be proportionate to the risk. So basically, you don't want to go overboard, but you need to ensure that any risk reduction is reasonably practical. And if you're going to say you're going to do something and reduce the risk, then really in the document you need to make sure that you do follow up on that, because that document is your promise to the regulators that if the risk is unacceptable and I will control it to an acceptable level with these activities, then you need to demonstrate that you've actually performed those activities. And really sort of make sure you've got the resources, time and effort, behind it before you start promising things that you can't sort of deliver on. Very often you can downgrade mitigations. It basically undermines your commitment to the risk management process if they see that you've actually set these high expectations and then revise the document to bring it down because you decided either you haven't got the resources to do that, or it's now those resources are competing with something else. So be very careful what you promise for. You're promising within the risk assessment tool, because basically those are commitments to reducing the risk, and you need to be aware that these documents are quality records, that they will be scrutinized by regulators. Not just the end product, but how they were actually derived over time during the development of the product. Other catch up, make sure you've got the right people in terms of the right competencies. We sort of touched on that in terms of technical expertise. Obviously, you need a clinical input in terms of if it's a medical device. Don't second guess how your customer uses the product. Ideally, use them in the process. If you can get a customer that says, actually, this is how I use the product in the real world, that is really invaluable in terms of understanding the product. And also agree beforehand how you decide in terms of the scoring of the risk assessment and the mitigation activities. That decision-making process needs to be fairly clear up front. Is it going to be majority vote? Is it the one that shouts the loudest? Is there be one that's close to the clinician? Is it going to be the project leader? You've got to have to decide up front how you're going to sort of decide, what's good enough and what those mitigations activities are going to be, because these sessions do generate a lot of excitement and heat in terms of not only identifying the potential risks and documenting them, also very quite robust discussions in terms of what people believe to be the appropriate approaches to reduce risk. So this is the next stage, where it's basically an expectation you evaluate the whole overall risk of the device. So in terms of the overall risk of the device, one of the concepts here is basically, you can have lots of all the individual risks within the device may be quite acceptable, but when you collectively look at them all together, they may actually roll up into a risk level that's not acceptable. So there is an expectation. You don't just look at the individual ones, which you must. You look at the whole shebang in terms of assessing the overall residual risk. However, the standard gives no guidance really on how you do that in terms of overall residual risk. And it's not as easy as just doing an average, because you can't really do averages of some of these RPNs. It's not really appropriate. So one way to do it is by what I call expert panel. Basically, you get an expert panel containing who've got representatives for the cross-functional team and clinicians who've got an intimate knowledge of the diagnostic, know the control measures, know the state of the art of the device and other devices, and basically make an overall assessment of the residual risk of the device, and basically document that. And usually they include R&D, quality operations, and medical affairs, in order to sort of get that combined. Step back of the risk assessment and do a sort of, actually based on all of this knowledge, I believe the overall risk of the device is acceptable, or it's in the middle zone, but. That process you do need to document, and you also need to document in your SOPs and procedures how you're going to actually get to that answer, because as I said, it's not clear how you do that in the standard, but there is an expectation you do it. So on the home straight here, in terms of the risk management process, we're at the next stage of basically risk management review, and then we go on to risk management post-production and post-production activities. So risk management review is basically the overall sign-off of the record, in terms of taking that sheet and then usually generating a report to sign off the whole shebang. The next stage really is once you've launched the product, in terms of what is the market telling you from the signals in the market and internal signals within your factory, in terms of are those risk levels that you predicted, and the impact of those control measures, are they what you expect? So basically, at this stage, there's an expectation that you understand, the performance of the device in the field. You get feedback from your customers, and you get signals from your production and supply chain to sort of evaluate whether your residual risk was actually appropriate. And obviously, if it isn't, you need to go through some other form of risk reduction or mitigation in terms of reducing risk. So the final stage of production and post-production activities covers assessing the effectiveness of your risk control measures at intervals based on the data sets in terms of the internal data sets, in terms of non-conformances, but also the external data sets in terms of feedback from the field. And really looking at intervals, very often part of quality system management review, to look at the whole end-to-end process. Is your risk management methodology and process meeting the requirements of the regulations and standards, but also meeting the requirements in terms of driving down risk for the end user of your products. So in this module, we've looked at some of the classical risk assessment methodologies and approaches that come out of the standard, and in the next module, we look at another variant of risk assessment in terms of FMEA and how that can be used and how it differs from the classical approach that we've covered in this module.